Oops, did I do something terrible? It's okay. All right, good. During his elegant and eloquent encomium to the extraordinary depth and power of his memory, St. Augustine writes in the Confessions, in the translation of Maria Bolding. Is it possible to get that down a bit? Because it's right in my eyes. That's better. Thank you. Okay. So this is from Confessions, Book 10. I arrive in the fields and the vast mansions of memory where are treasured innumerable images brought in from objects of every conceivable kind perceived by the senses. There too are hidden away the modified images we produce when by our thinking we magnify or diminish or in any way alter the information our senses have reported. There too is everything else that has been consigned and stored away and not yet engulfed and buried in oblivion. The huge repository of the memory, with its secret and unimaginable caverns, welcomes and keeps all these things to be recalled and brought out for use when needed, and as all of them have their particular ways into it, so all are put back again in their proper places. What Augustine's analysis stresses is memory as techne, the procedures and processes of recollection, and not the truth content or the accuracy of its images. As an art of invention, memoria artificialis, as it's known in the Middle Ages, the art of memory, was cast as a procedure of reasoning with links as close to dialectic's task of inventing arguments as to rhetoric's task of composing. When the ancient texts of the Rhetorica ad Herennium and Aristotle's treatise De Memoria came to be taught in the 12th century, they seemed to confirm and to deepen an understanding that was already present in monastic schools, which regarded human recollection as capable of being trained for rational investigation with procedures akin to those of dialectic. The purpose of such memory craft is primarily invention, achieved by enabling the activities designated by both of the English words which derive from Latin inventio, first making and stocking an inventory of materials, and second, creating newly composed inventions. Inventory and invention are the same root. It's in these two senses that I will explore today the role in the Middle Ages of mnemonic structures, often architectural in form, although not always, as the primary instruments for inventing new work. In one of the most moving acts of his reign, when Charlemagne decided to collect a great library to build up at the palace school of his court in Aachen, he did so first by bringing over from England a person, Alcuin of York. Alcuin, in turn, collected a group of scholars about him to form the palace school and thus to create the palace library. Of course, they brought books with them, but mostly they brought their learning stored away in the treasuries of their memories, and in doing so, Charlemagne, wittingly or not, was realizing an antique and early Christian trope and reality that one finds articulated in Jerome and Cassiodorus, among many others, that of the learned person as a living library, one who makes for him or herself a mental chest of memorized texts and other materials, including stories, melodies, and images, which are always then ready as a reference and meditation tool. For example, in his 60th epistle, Jerome wrote to a correspondent of a young man who had unfortunately just died, but who, he said, by means of careful reading and daily meditation, had made himself into a library of Christ, end quote. Over a century later, Cassiodorus described a blind Greek scholar named Eusebius, who had come to the monastery of Vivarium at Cassiodorus's invitation, presumably as part of his great effort to collect up knowledge. This Eusebius, Cassiodorus says, had been blind since childhood, and yet, quote, he had hidden away in the library of his memory many authors, so many books, that he could assuredly tell others who were reading in what part of a codex they might find what they had spoken of, end quote. Another example, also known to Cassiodorus, was the scriptural expositor Didymus of Alexandria, a man whose commentaries were renowned for their comprehensiveness and subtlety, and yet who had been blind from birth, and thus could read only by means of his memory. There are also examples of scholars from the later Middle Ages, including Thomas Aquinas, William of Ockham, Francesco Petrarca, whose reading and compositional habits make clear that the goal of making a library of one's memory was by no means dimmed in an age when written books were far more plentiful, at least to scholars. But how did they manage to do it? It's clear that while the accomplishment of men like Didymus and Eusebius is the occasion of near incredulity for Cassiodorus, it's not the fact of their having such vast memories that amazes him in his narrative, but the fact that they accomplished this feat without eyes to see the books that they read, which were read to them. Notice also that the blind Eusebius was able to tell a questioner precisely where in a codex to locate the text that he desired. This seemingly pointless accomplishment indicates to us, in fact, the key to Eusebius's success. His memory was designed in accordance with those basic principles of locational memory taught in ancient schools and augmented in the practices of monastic meditation, and I, of course, include Jewish meditation techniques here as well as Christians who learned them, after all, in Jewish monks and monasteries. In the curriculum of the Trivium, rote memorization was particularly associated with initial schooling in reading, the way of grammar, to invoke the model of the Trivium as the crossing of three ways or three routes. It was instilled in one's youth through the common exercise of recitatio, or recitation, as indeed it is to this very day, for those who actually do it, that is to say. Memoria rerum, or compositional memory, literally memory of things, of matters, was learned in the two more advanced paths of study, dialectic, or the study of the topics and seats of arguments and the relationships among propositions, and the study of rhetoric, the invention of new compositions. It was especially to the investigative and inventive tasks of dialectic and rhetoric that mnemonic art was addressed. Thus, as grammar provided the foundation upon which the Trivium built, so memorized texts and other images were thought to provide the exemplars and the materials for new composition. And because memoria is to such an extent the basis of an art of composition, the primary goals when preparing material for memory are flexibility, security, and the ease of combining matters into new patterns and forms. And basic to this are the two paired tasks, and they always come together, of division and collection. As conceived in rhetoric, to divide a matter into distinctions, and now I hope, is it going to come? It's up there, okay. But it's not here. Now, is there... Nope, it hasn't actually. But it's not... Okay, is he going to do it? Yoo-hoo.
Yeah, he did.
Is it here?
It will pick up the signal.
Yeah, it's coming. Here it is.
Ah, is it coming really? Seriously? Okay, good. Okay. So, as I said, it's conceived in rhetoric to divide a matter. You divide it into distinctiones, as they were called, distinctions, in order to preach or prepare other compositions. And doing this is not so much a matter for objective classification as a means for easily mixing and mingling a variety of matters, and to be able to know, and this is crucial, to be able to know where you are in your composition. Here you have an eagle beside a distinctio on the papal powers. The Latin, coming out of the eagle's mouth, reads, "These are those things which the Pope alone can perform." And then, as you see, there are 15 items of powers that the Pope alone has. But notice also that they are not just given to those little sort of ribbony things that go to each one of these clauses, and they are not just given to you in a single group of 15, but rather are divided. So 6 at the top, and then 5, and then 4. This is to ease the reading and comprehension of those 15 powers, because 15 is just an overwhelming matter for most people, and that grouping is absolutely crucial to how memory and recollection, rather, is performed. A simple, rigorous scheme like this one is critical to the practice of oratory, for it cues the journey, the itinerary, the via, as it's also called, of the speaker's principal points, in a manner similar to that of any outline, but with the greater flexibility that's needed for oral performance. It enables a speaker readily to enlarge a point, to digress from any one of these particular matters, for example, if you cared to do so, to make spontaneous side trips and variations of all sorts, because one can always be sure of one's location in the composition. Not in the manner of a parrot, which reciting automatically doesn't need to know where it is, but rather in the manner of a pilot who understands his location relative to his goal from distinctive markers in the water and on the horizon. You can think of these as distinctive markers. I'm now showing you the original digital computer, the hand. This is one of the oldest forms that we have in manuscripts, the so-called hand of Bede, although it antedates Bede by quite a lot. And this is a hand that is used for finding the date of Easter. It's part of a computus, so-called computus lore. Here's another one, perhaps more familiar to some of you here. This is the so-called Gridonian hand, used in musical composition. And here, another hand, used this time, the so-called manus meditationis, which was used for rehearsing one's vices, the vices and virtues, both prior to going to sleep at night and also getting up in the morning. So these drawings of a left hand, all 3 of them, you sometimes get right hands, but it's almost always the left hand that gets drawn. These drawings diagram how to compute solutions to entirely different procedures and problems. One is the liturgical calendar, how to reckon the movable feasts throughout the year. One is for learning and recalling musical relationships, including melodies unheard before. And this one for meditation on penance, sin, and virtue. And of the 3 I've shown, it alone is usually diagrammed using both hands. One for the nighttime for sins, usually on, as here, the left hand, and one in the morning for one's blessings on the right hand. The techne diagrammed on these various hands is complex, and no one, to my knowledge, has quite worked out each system, even though they sometimes come with an instruction manual, but of course there's nothing unusual about that. These calculation hands share certain basic characteristics. I'm just reviewing them again for you. This 1, 2, and 3. In each hand, the hand is conceived as a schematic for making particular sets of calculations. Each makes use of 19 places laid out onto the hand, 3 on the thumb and 4 on each finger. And these same 19 places are drawn for the penitential hand as well as for the other 2, although it doesn't appear that there's any numerical need for 19 dictated by the type of content displayed. I mean, there are many more sins, after all, than simply 19, as we all know. So we appear to have, in these various hands, a scheme, a basic computing scheme based on 19, which is adaptable to a variety of content and uses, rather than something that's been designed uniquely for each particular task. The musical hand, as is often pointed out, has 20 places on it, one behind the medial finger, but the 20 is visualized on the hand as 19 plus 1. Okay, so the basic scheme remains 19. Now, rather than thinking of such a diagram simply as a representation of some prior content, or even as a substitute calculator in our sense, we should perhaps conceive of it as a highly versatile locating tool for locating very specific kinds of information. There are 3 sections on the thumb because 3 places are needed there for calculating something's position. Just as in our own base 10 algorithmic scheme, only 9 digits can go into a single column of places, and when it's filled up, each 10 then carries over to the next column, as it were to the next finger to the left. So calculation performed on the hand, a hand like this, is visual and also tactile, but most important of all, it's spatial. If you've ever watched anybody using a hand, now you still can find people sometimes, especially I would guess in the Middle East and in Asia who do, very often they don't just look at the hand like this, but rather they'll take their finger and they'll actually point to places on the hand. And I think that tactile matrix, that tactile involvement is very much important to it. It may also help to explain why it's usually the left hand, because of course you want your right hand for indicating, emphasizing places. So it's visual, it's tactile, but most important of all, it's spatial. Each of the numbers, for the purposes of a calculation, occupies one of the locations on the hand that we must imagine as though it had spatial characteristics and, importantly, also boundaries. So when content is conceived of in this way, it can be moved about, like a counter, indeed like a number, within the place of the calculation device. So rather than just being affixed like a label, a counter can operate in a variety of mnemonic and investigative ways. One can move in several directions from each place, right? And of course, as those of you who are familiar with this hand, you move down here, and then up, and then across, and in a kind of spiral pattern. Rather than being affixed like a label, a counter can operate in this variety of contexts. You can also skip, if you want to, of course, from one place to another. You're not fixed to go from 1, 2, 3, 4. You can go from here to here, if you wish to. And you can go backwards, not just in one way. Locational schemes always build such flexibility into themselves. They are random access, or perhaps better thought of as multiple access schemes. And in that way, of course, they are very much like the more electronic digital computer. In both antiquity and the Middle Ages, the commonest model for human memory likened it to a tablet or a parchment page upon which a person writes. This model is extremely old and widespread, and it's very interesting that even in antiquity, when actual books were written onto rolls, the model for memory remains that of a flat rectangular surface which can be taken in with a single mental look. Okay, it's not a roll in antiquity, it's a flat rectangular surface. They usually likened it to a wax tablet. The page can become quite complex. Oops, sorry, wrong direction here. No, wrong direction. Come on. There we are. Here's a full opening from the 12th century of one such page of memory. In this case, a psalter with several commentaries. The mise en page of this book illustrates many basic principles of the arts of memory. The Psalms, of course, was one of the fundamental texts of high medieval culture, the one book that every educated person was expected to learn by heart as part of an aspect really of learning to read in the first place. It was considered foundational not just to literacy and moral character, but indeed to rational thought itself. Scholars like Hugh of St. Victor, 12th century, thought in and composed by means of the Psalter. And anybody who has looked at their work, you can find these Psalter phrases if you do a word search on them over and over and over again, even when they don't necessarily cite it directly. In order to memorize and work with such a long text, it was cut up into brief segments and then located mentally in an orderly scheme. And this order could be anything, so long as it was clear and readily recoverable. Numbers and the alphabet were two obvious schemes that fit those requirements, although others were in use as well. The scheme of divisions into chapters and verses imposed on the Bible even today was largely in place by the 4th century, even though it was not fully written out in books until the 16th century. And here you see on this page the textual divisions, the verses that is to say, of Psalm 58. They're written in a large script, here and here. These are the actual psalms themselves here. Each is marked by a painted initial. By building chains of such segments in one's memory, a very long work, such as all of the Psalms, or indeed the whole of the Aeneid, can readily be retained and securely recovered either in its original order or rearranged and extracted to suit a new composition simply by rehearsing various numerical sequences, like 58-2, for example. That's what it's good for. 58-2, you can jump then to 58-4, in the same way you can jump from 2 to 4. Each division of the main text is treated as though it were a separate place in the order, and the commentary is then written into the margins. So, for example, here we have the main text and then the commentary around it in the margins. Actually, in this case, we have Jerome's so-called Gallican translation of the Bible, and next to it the so-called Hebrew translation, slightly different. Surrounding the main characters, the segments of the commentary are linked to the main text to which they refer by this common initial. Here's the commentary starting here, for example. And in some cases, there is a little figural drawing. I mean, here, for example, the D is filled in with a little, I don't think you can see it very well, with a little sort of florid thing on the inside of the initial. And surrounding the main commentaries, as for example here, are margins containing yet other commentary, and in the outermost margins there are brackets that indicate the sources, the original sources of the texts, as Augustine, Cassiodorus, Jerome, and others. The commentary text itself is that of Peter Lombard, but Peter Lombard, of course, puts together excerpts from these earlier glosses, so that the gloss of Peter Lombard is not by our standards an original work, it's rather composed of former glosses, which are composed of yet other glosses, and so forth. The whole thing is an extraordinary edifice, really. These marginal areas can also indicate both correction and disagreement among the sources. And here, you see this character down here in the corner. Here he is in large. This is Augustinus, pointing to the commentary and saying, as you see, ego aliter. I say something else. So the page shown here was intended for study and meditation. It was not to be used, obviously, by beginning readers. Indeed, the manuscript is not a single work. I mean, I think it's best to think of it that way, but a whole library of materials, a kind of encyclopedia of related knowledge gathered into its pages. So its places are thought of, the places being the verses, as not simply two-dimensional, but are conceived and used like boxes or rooms, like cells, like those in a beehive in which this other material can be collected. Now, the background schemes that are used in monastic contexts to organize memory vary greatly. One could choose among using an architecturally modeled plan and section of a large, though entirely literary building, for example, Noah's Ark. You could use the feathers on the 6 wings of a seraphic angel, a 5-story, 5-room section of a house, the stones in the wall of a turreted castle, the rungs of ladders, or a world map, like this one. This, of course, oops, why did I do this again? Okay. This, of course, here is the Red Sea, right? And this, I think I'm right, Marcia, here. This little, particularly elegant little place here is, of course, the monastery of Saint-Servais, putting itself on the map, as it were. Gardens are also very popular. The medieval sort of garden, with orderly beds of medicinal plants and fruit trees, separated by grass and surrounded by a wall. Undoubtedly, gardens became popular with monastic and later writers because of the Song of Songs, a preeminent text for mystical meditation. Now, we would never now think to organize an encyclopedia of knowledge on a map such as this one, but for a clerical audience to whom this picture was as familiar as the order of the alphabet is to us, and notice, of course, it's the order of history, even more so, and of Christendom, even more so than it is of geography. So, familiar as this order is, why not use a map of history? It provides a simple, clearly arranged composition site containing many useful compartments with multiple routes among them. And of course, the map is very important because of the routes, as we know. And thus can serve as a foundational map to use in arranging one's subjects and materials. This map is conventionally included in all the manuscripts of this particular work, a large and very well-known commentary on the Apocalypse. And it's included as a necessary part of the machinery of the book. It's not an add-on. It's really necessary part of using the book. For the book is conceived of as an engine for thinking and not just a repository of content. Perhaps the best known recollective schemes in the Middle Ages involve architecture, that is, imagining a building in one's mind. The advice given in the Rhetorica ad Herennium, the focus of Francis Yates's study on the art of memory in the Renaissance, is quite specific about what sort of building this should be: a Roman house or an arcade, a recess or a niche. One should pick a place that's familiar and can often be revisited to refresh its details. And into the compartments formed by such architectural features, one places those vivid marker images, the notationes, as Cicero calls them, that are linked to specific materials. Into the compartments formed by such features, the images that are made anew and erased according to each new task, but the backgrounds themselves are stable and lasting. So in the niche, you could place an image for one oration, erase it, place an image for another oration, etc. The analogy that the author of this work makes is to writing on a wax tablet, for the images, he says, are like the letters which one erases after each use, but the backgrounds are like the supporting surface of the wax tablet itself. It's clear from what is said here that he's thinking of a situation of frequent new composition, not one of stable archival storage. This is very important. We historians must not confuse those two tasks. This is all about invention. More standard advice was given about the mnemonic places. They must always have a coherent, easily recognized order among themselves. Placing memories also spatializes them because they occupy relative locations and not absolute ones. And these places have other characteristics that make them distinct. Their internal order is absolutely clear and simple. For example, every 5th or 10th place might be specially marked, perhaps by color. In the preface to his Chronicle of Biblical History, Hugh of St. Victor takes pains to caution that each place containing the text of a psalm carry its number prominently, as well as its initial words, its incipit, rather as though one were looking at the shelf marks and titles of books in a library case. The backgrounds must be immediately visible. They must be moderately lighted, not too dim nor too bright for the eye of the mind to perceive them, in one conspectus, that is, one look of the mental eye. Crowding is a fault because it produces recollective confusion. So not only must there be no more images in any single place than one can readily and distinctly take in as a group, usually no more than 4, but there must be space between each location as well. Optimally, some people said, 5 or 6 feet. And how long would 6 mental feet be? Far enough that one must imagine walking to the next place over for separate, distinct look at what is in the next scene. The places must also be 3-dimensional, like a box or a room, and moderate in size. Peter of Ravenna, a 15th century legal master in Bologna, says that a grown man stretching out his arms should be able to touch the ceiling and the sides. And most medieval and ancient writers, including the Auctorata Rerum, do not imagine themselves in their mental rooms, but rather standing before them and gazing from a distance, they say, of about 30 feet. Mental feet, of course. Roman Republican architecture is the one most often associated now with such techne. But far more lasting and influential architecture for memory work developed in the meditational practices of classical Judaism and early Christian monasticism. And this was based not on a real but an ideal architecture, exactly those great buildings described in measured detail in the Bible. Noah's Ark, the tabernacle of Exodus 25, and here famous drawing from the Amiatinus manuscript of the Ark of the Tabernacle. The temple that was built by Solomon in 1 Kings, and the great visionary recreation of the temple in Ezekiel chapter 40 following. The heavenly city imagined by John in the Apocalypse chapter number 20. And these structures served as the basis of meditations on themselves and also as ordering devices for further meditation in the manner of the Memoria Rerum scenes counseled in ancient rhetoric, but differently and more encyclopedically imagined. Notice also on both of these, both this, the Apocalypse, the heavenly city, and also the Amiatinus tabernacle, that what is depicted here is a cube. This is a 3-dimensional figure, and you can tell that by the fact that you're looking on the outside of the curtains here and on the inside of the curtains here. So it's not a flat bird's eye perspective. The same thing here, these sort of heart-like arrangements in the corners here was explained to me by an artist. I couldn't figure out what they were. He said, oh yes, of course, but that's so that it can be folded up. We should distinguish here between the kind of drawings and plans that are part of the literal exegesis of a specific biblical text, as here, and those which serve as summary statements and orientations for other texts in the manner of verbal ekphrasis. To remind everybody, an ekphrasis is a rhetorical figure in which a building or other work of art is described in a manner to bring it imaginatively before the mind's eyes. In the Renaissance, this exercise in description usually used actual works of art, but in the Middle Ages, the objects of ekphrasis were usually fictive and usually also biblical in origin. The Greek word ekphrasis was translated into Latin as descriptio, which is one of the most common verbal figures identified in medieval literature. So, rhetorical descriptio is a figure of thought, a means for further invention, as is clear in a composition treatise from the 12th century, the beginning of the 13th century, called Poetria Nova by the Paris English scholar Geoffrey of Van Soof. And even the drawings linked to the literal commentary are intended to be built upon, as the literal words of the Bible give rise to more moral and symbolic constructions that are linked to and build up from them. Hugh of St. Victor composed an ekphrastic reconstruction of Noah's Ark. Now, this is not an ekphrasis. This is literal exegesis of this particular chapter, these two particular chapters in Ezekiel. But Hugh of St. Victor composed an ekphrastic reconstruction of Noah's Ark, which he called De Formatione Arche, or concerning the plan of the ark. He requires his readers to use this description, descriptio, in ways that fully realize the imaginative potential of this rhetorical figure as an engine of invention. He begins as follows. First, in order to show in a figure the religious meanings of Noah's Ark, I find the center of the plane on which to depict the ark, and there I fix a point. Around this point I make a small square, which is like the cubit by which the ark is measured out. And around this square I draw another one, slightly bigger, because remember, it's a cube, right? It's three-dimensional. I paint a cross in the inner square. I'm skipping a bit. So that its arms touch each side of the square, and I paint over it in gold. And in the middle of the golden cross, which I made, I paint a yearling lamb standing upright, just to remind you a little bit. Okay? A very great many additional figures and notations are drawn into this diagram by Hugh as his description proceeds. So many that they cannot all be encompassed upon a single physical drawing. Moreover, at one point Hugh says that the whole plan must be imagined as elevated, the square with the cross being drawn upwards in the mind's eye so that it forms a central column for the ark. In fact, it's clear that this description is for an imagined construction, for all the verbs that Hugh uses are in the present tense. Pingo, I paint; depingo, also I paint, I describe; and fingo, I fashion. Verbs also used in medieval advice about making images for use as memory markers. The various diagrams and figures which Hugh places in his ark, genealogies, histories, a Bible catalog, a mappa mundi, trees of vices and virtues, a geographia, a cosmologia, an angelology, and many others besides. These form an encyclopedia of images and structures that mark content pertinent to all aspects of monastic learning and contemplative life. As I've said elsewhere, Hugh's imaginary picture of the ark reminds me of nothing so much as the complex sculptural programs of a major cathedral, one perhaps like Saint-Denis, with whose encyclopedic program Hugh is thought by some historians to have been associated. But unlike the pictures which accompany the exegesis of Ezekiel, the literal exegesis composed by his contemporary at St. Victor, Richard, which you see here, no pictures accompany Hugh's book. Others of his work do have diagrams, faithfully copied, notably the diagram Hugh made for his Universal Chronicle of Biblical History. The complete lack of illustration in any of the many manuscripts of the plan of the ark is, at least to my mind, dispositive evidence that the picture of the ark which Hugh paints is a rhetorical ekphrasis, a figure for thinking, and does not describe an existing object. It's designed to raise up pictures for the eyes of the mind, pictures of a highly rationalized sort. And it was composed, Hugh says, as a picture summatim, that is, in summary fashion, as the last section of a much longer moral treatise that Hugh composed on the Ark of Noah. The two works, separated in the Patrologia Latina database, belong together, and they have at last been published that way in the Corpus Christianorum edition of this work. A paragraph joins them as follows, quoting, "Now I will offer an exemplar of our own plan for the ark, as I have promised. I depict it as though it were an actual object, so that you may learn outwardly what you should do inwardly, and so that once you imprint the form of this example in your heart, you will be glad that the house of God has been built inside of you." Quote. Another Victorine who used a biblical construction as a summary picture for a longer treatise was Richard of St. Victor himself. His so-called Benjamin Major, or as it's now called, the Mystical Ark, is a long meditation on the Ark of the Tabernacle, not that of Noah, as the life of contemplation. It also ends with a summary picture of the preceding work, using as its structuring device, its dispositio, to use the term from rhetoric, the description of the ark which occurs in Exodus. But no drawings accompany this Victorine work either. Though, as you see, Richard could draw wonderful pictures of temple buildings for his literal exegesis of Ezekiel, as Hugh had done for his lists of dates and names in the Bible. In other words, they drew graphic pictures when they chose to do so, and, always an important point for medieval historians to keep in mind, the scribes copied them when they were in their exemplars. They didn't leave them out. The meditation on Ezekiel and other great imaginary biblical edifices is an exercise commonly performed throughout the Middle Ages. Jerome's commentary on Ezekiel is filled with ekphrastic amplification of the visionary pictures and the words. Bede commented on the temple and its furniture. Gregory the Great composed a set of sermons on Ezekiel that moralized the structures of the temple vision. Adam Scott of Dryburgh, a contemporary of the great Victorines, commented on the tabernacle, including an ekphrastic picture as part of his commentary. Even Abelard commented on Ezekiel, and towards the end of this tradition, Isaac Newton drew sketches of an idealized Jerusalem temple. In this very long tradition, the structures tend to be conflated, conceived as exemplars of one another, as indeed the Bible itself presents them. The exemplary nature of the biblical structures is always stressed, but so is the merit of measuring them precisely. So it's sort of the architecture involved in it. Measuring the temple in Ezekiel is presented specifically as a penitential exercise. This also carries over into monastic traditions. Measuring ensures careful visualization of each construction and the concentration that's basic to the practices of meditation, hence that emphasis. This famous drawing, known as the Plan of St. Gall, comes out of the same tradition of meditation. Some historians have taken it to have been offered as a schematic plan for real monasteries, but most now believe that it was not, that it was what its composer said it was, a device for meditation. Abbot Hato of Reichenau writes thus to Abbot Gosbert of St. Gall, I have sent you, Gosbert, my dearest son, these few designs, these exemplars, he says, for placing the monastic offices, by means of which you may exercise your wits. Do not think that I have elaborated it because we considered that you need our instructions, but believe that it was drawn, and the word he uses is pingo, pinxisse, in God's love for you alone to scrutinize. As Wolfgang Braunfels commented, the plan is to promote meditation upon the meaning and worth of the monastic life. By calling it models for the disposition of the various services of monastic life, Hato would seem to be emphasizing its idealized and moralized function, as affording the dispositio, the organized method of the composition, and thus also the ways in which one might make one's journey by its means. In the 9th century, a commentator labeled the church in this drawing the templum. You see that there. This isn't an unusual usage when referring to churches, but in this particular context it does have some added significance. The entrance way, which is also the route into all the offices of monastic life, was given the legend, a bit later than the drawing itself. This is the way, the via, to the holy temple for the multitudes, by means of which they conduct their prayers and return in joy. And notice how the drawing includes all sorts of doorways and entrances, including here to the cloister and so on. One must imagine it not just as a material construction, but also the routes that are created through it. Because architecture always implies movement. This feature is also built into this model for composition. The great imaginary buildings are traveled into, around, and through. They present paths and routes. In mnemonic art, described in the ancient Rhetorica ad Herennium, having constructed one's imaginary house full of places and put one's active images into them, one proceeds during the actual delivery of a speech by taking a mental walk through the places. Individual medieval compositions, whether poetry or orations, melodies or paintings, or idealized architectural plans, are most frequently conceived of as journeys. Medieval paintings tend not to have a fixed perspective, but imply several. Medieval narratives tend to be strung together as episodes on a journey. Medieval chant was performed through complex liturgical journeys, both temporal, through the day and the year, but also processional. Here's an example of a preacher's diagram called the Tower of Wisdom, composed in this form probably late in the 13th century by a Franciscan friar named John of Metz. The diagram is a kind of machine, and machina literally in Latin is a hoist by which you build walls, for inventing a large number of sermons related to the general subject of the vices and virtues. The Turris Sapientiae presents a space for large-scale composition, or indeed for many small-scale compositions on general themes, in the form of groups of places and images linked together as a chain or grouped in a scene. And the places within it are disposed in easily perceived courses of stone, and one climbs through these levels in one's mind as one ascends the tower. The various stages are additionally indicated by the letters of the alphabet, each one marking a new topic. One can see these along the base and up the sides of the tower. And I've given you here one of the instruction manuals that in one manuscript accompanies this. You start down here with the bases of the columns, then the columns themselves, the capitals, mount the stairs, you look at the width of the building, you notice the height of the building, you go through to the doors, to the windows, the doors are here, the windows, and then you start climbing up through, I think it starts at K, if I'm not mistaken, K, all the way up to X. There's no Y, of course, and then Z is up here at the top in the hoardings. Each stone is clearly distinct from the others and has only a word or a very short phrase written on it. No place is crowded. One can mentally either stand back and see the tower as a whole, or one can move in closer to examine a single stone or row, such as the steps at the base. Thus, we should never think of these medieval pictures like these I have shown you as static, the charge so often made against medieval art. They're in constant movement, not only because they depict active figures, but most importantly because of the activities which such pictures demand from their audiences, their viewers, their listeners, their users. It's this characteristic that makes them machines in our sense of the word, which gives them the dynamism that enables creative construction and inventive composition. In Poetry Nova, Geoffrey of Vansoof writes, "For the beginning of the poem, the art described above has offered a variety of movement. The poem's progress now invites you onward. By means of your pre-visualized image, direct your step further along the road's course. The way continues along two routes, two vii. There will be either a wide path or a narrow, either a river or a brook. You may advance at a leisurely play pace or leap swiftly ahead. You may relate the matter with brevity or draw it out in a lengthy discourse." And a bit further on, discussing the trope of digression, Geoffrey observes, "Sometimes as I advance along the way, I leave the middle of the road, and with a kind of leap I fly off to the side, as it were. Then I return to the poem whence I had digressed, knowing exactly where I was." This constant tension, expressed in so many medieval arts, between path and digression, between endpoint and byways, between journey and resting stations, is expressed in this particular model of composition, in which the artist is at the same time both an architect and also a map maker. And one final role of the maker emphasized by Geoffrey is that of the conjurer, prestigiatrix, someone who juggles and practices sleight of hand. The artist plays with his material, moving it about, changing it around, constantly inventing during the procedure of disposing its various parts. Geoffrey describes it as a kind of game playing, a kind of mental calculating that involves shifting counters from one place to another, and thereby, quote, causes the last to be first, the future to be present, the oblique to be straight, the remote to be near, what is rustic becomes urbane, what is old becomes new, end quote. Medieval invention is thought of as the placement and replacement of materials, the collection and recollection of subject matters, all enabled by the spatial and locational nature of investigative memoria, which is its primary engine. So I hope I've been able to demonstrate to you today, at least in an introductory way, that the craft of memory, like its successor investigative arts, including systematic logic, is not fundamentally just an overly complicated procedure for preparing to pass examinations or for memorizing lists of random facts. It is, in fact, ill-suited to rote repetition, as people who have written about it have been pointing out now for over 2,000 years. It's time, I think, we paid attention to what they say. Rather than an art of memory, the art of memory was a craft enabling the creation of new knowledge from familiar materials and for investigating difficult subjects in the form of debate and commentary. The concepts of place and marker are basic to it because the secure ordering of material in places gave one the flexibility and security necessary to make something out of the information one had learned, whether in the form of lengthy texts or of long lists of facts. Manuscript paintings and drawings such as these I have shown you are not only pretty pictures, but imply within them a whole science of recollection and a comprehensive investigative method. They are the gatehouses of the mind for those with the knowledge to use them, those who are skilled in the arts of memory and possessing the keys of study which those arts provided. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have, of course, time for questions. We have learned a lot about the organization of knowledge, and the book is an engine of such an organization of intellectual activities. So, the floor is yours.
A lot to take in. Yes, Adam.
Would you be so kind as to go back to the hand diagram?
Yep. Yeah, which one?
It doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter?
I was just wondering about your emphasis on the spatial quality of these diagrams, but I wonder if that component is more important for what the diagram is representing is an activity, right? And you demonstrated that by taking your right index finger and pointing to your left palm, right? So is the spatial aspect more important when I do this, or when I look at the diagram, or is there no difference whatsoever? I mean, I just wonder, is there any difference between the actions I take on my hand with my hands themselves, or the mental actions I take when I look at a diagram?
I think in part, I don't know that I can generalize about that. Because one of the things that, this is standard mnemonic advice, of course, is that everybody ultimately has to make their own. Right? I mean, that you can't use somebody else's system just automatically, the way like taking a pill or something like that. All I can say is that it seems to me that the tact, or at least for some people, the tactile act, the tactile contact between the placement of, say, the alpha here and to the beta is more cognitively recognizable and more emphatic if you actually do this rather than simply looking at that. I'm not enough of a... But well, it seems to me that this is something that perhaps the psychologist should study a bit to see whether, in fact, it does make a difference, and if there isn't something. Certainly, the sense of touch, which most people who've written on the senses have always emphasized that in antiquity and in the Middle Ages that the sense of sight was the most important and was given sort of primary pride of place in terms of understanding. And in many schemes, of course, that's quite true, although I think to impose too strict a hierarchy is a mistake. But there are other schemes, and they come often out of the monastic tradition, that place touch first. And of course, there is that whole theory about sight, the extramission of sight, that really sees, in some people say, that sight itself is a form of touch, because the rays come out from the eye and actually touch the object before they come back in. Yeah,
Just to follow up, Mary, do you imagine that people ever touched these hand diagrams?
they may very well have.
But there's no indication of wear on any of the ones that you.
None of the ones I've seen, but very often not this one, because this is a very fancy computer sort of thing and difficult. But this one, the hand diagram, the Guidonian hand, is often I've seen it painted on monastery walls, mostly from 15th and 16th century, so that it's later, presumably where the monks were learning their chant. And in those cases, it seems to me possible that people were actually touching it. What I've never seen is anybody saying that it has the kind of wear on it, you know, that say those famous images that everybody thinks that were undoubtedly kissed or rubbed had. Yeah.
Now that Adam just brought you back to the hand, I'm reminded of the fact that in the Hebrew Bible and in biblical Hebrew, hand is one of the synonyms for memory.
It is for memory.
And
Mm-hmm.
we have, for example, Yad Vashem, and the memorial place for Absalom is called in the Bible the hand of Absalom. I don't know what the King James, but literally.
Yeah.
So I wonder to what degree, of course I'm not asking you about the long-term impact of the biblical notion on medieval culture, but to what degree perhaps medieval commentators on such verses where hand is associated with memory may have been addressed to this issue.
That's a very interesting point. I hadn't thought about it, partly because I didn't know, since Hebrew is, I don't know Hebrew well. But it would be worth going back and checking to see how Jerome, for example, and indeed how the Septuagint has translated that particular word.
Less of actual translations and more in the sense of medieval commentators, say,
Mm-hmm.
the big three schools who are familiar with mnemonic techniques that might be associated to hand, and then ways of perhaps linking the biblical verse with the medieval techniques.
I've not seen that, but it would certainly be well worth checking. Because, of course, I mean, as we know, the hand is a ubiquitous instrument of memory. I can't think of a culture where it isn't. Yeah.
And to note of the hand, you don't have to use both hands in order to count, because you can use the thumb for everything else.
Yes, you can.
His finger for the thumb.
That's right. Yes, absolutely. It's incredibly versatile.
Several models for memory, such as the hand, architectural constructions, the book. Is there a passage from one model to another, or some relation? That is, would you start with one model and pass to another one, or is there a hierarchy of these methods?
Not in the mnemonic advice that I've looked at. The mnemonic advice that comes to us from the rhetoric textbooks, for example, is usually very disappointing to people because it's extremely simple. It's short. It's confined to maybe a couple of dozen basic principles that would apply to all of these things. So they don't talk about, like the book being something that, that you advance to in, say, high school or something like that, where you start out with the hand. And I don't think they actually think about it that way, because the hand, although it looks to us perhaps as the most simple, but certainly the one you carry around with you all the time, the most accessible, in fact, calculations on the hand can be incredibly complicated. No, I can't think that there's, and I don't think there's a prejudice about using one as distinct from another. As I said, mnemonic advice, again, it tends to be very, very practical. So whatever works for you, basically, is what they say.
Yeah, there's one question over there.
Thank you very much. I'm thinking about hand makes me think about other forms of embodiment of formalized practices of formalized knowledge. And I'm thinking about the inscription of knowledge to the body through the voice, the studied voice. So we know that a very common memory aid in the Renaissance was versification and chant.
Mm-hmm.
Psalters, for example, primers for children for learning
there are some rather tantalizing texts. I don't know whether they're images or not. I mean, other than the medical images, obviously, that is inscribed on the body for obvious sorts of reasons. But there are certainly some advice where you can use the other parts of the body as a kind of memory device, as long as you keep going in the same direction. I think that's one of the problems there. I don't have the picture with me, but there's a very famous, I showed it actually in the seminar, there's a very famous set of woodcuts that comes with an early 15th, 16th century preacher's manual, in which the chapters of the Gospels are inscribed in a set of pictures. One Gospel is longer than another, so there are more pictures for, say, Matthew than there are for John, etc. But no more than about 7 chapters in order, and there's an image for each chapter. And the main thing is that the images, you have to go in a particular, the images always go in the same order. It's not 1, 2, 3, 4 like this. It's 1, 2, 3, I think 4, 5, something like that, at any rate. And somebody pointed out to me once that there is another set where it's, instead of being the Latin rhythm, it's the Greek one, which goes the other way. So I think it's the consistency. The structure has to be very simple and very consistent, because whereas the images can certainly change, and virtually almost, as I said, anything goes. Whatever works for you would do that. But it would be certainly worth looking to see about the voice. We all know, of course, and this is certainly in the advice as well, rhyme, rhythm, metrics. These are absolutely essential mnemonic, patterns. Yeah.
Mary, I'm interested in the wall painting hand that you just mentioned.
Yep.
Do you know of non-manuscript or facilitators of memory and recollection that are from the Middle Ages, not as late as the one you had, or from non-monastic contexts?
That were specifically that way?
No, not specifically that, but things that are, I mean, do we have evidence for interest in memory and its recollection outside of manuscripts? So in any other media?
Absolutely.
Or in any other class or group outside
Yep.
of monasteries?
Yep, absolutely. We do. They tend not to go into it in great detail because it's basic, But there's advice to use your local church for a set of mnemonic places if you want to do that. There's advice again, most of them are later, but there's a rather famous treatise that involves using what was then the organization of the cathedral in Salzburg as a route of memory through the altars in one thing or another. You're bound to find it in the monasteries used that way. You're bound to find it in courts as well, presumably, because you can either use it or not, depending on what you want to do. Most of it that we've seen painted that would be recognizable as some sort of calculative memory tool is in learned circles. So I'm thinking, for example, of the set of murals at Anagni. Famously, and that sort of thing. Prayer books in courts, for noble households and so forth. Much has been written about those as, especially for the psalters and things like that, as in containing within them things that make it easier to use them as reading texts, for example. Michael Clancy's written about it and various other people. But in terms of something like that, I would say no. And in fact, the one piece of advice actually that's not true. One piece of advice I'm thinking of right now is a manual of rhetoric written by a man named Boncampagno de Signa, and he taught in Bologna in the very early 13th century. And he talks about an ideal classroom. And he says, among other things, that there to be no pictures on the wall unless they aid in learning. But otherwise he wants it painted a nice green. Which I don't know about you, but my classrooms were often painted a nice green. Some things never change.
Just a comment about the hand and the centrality.
Mm.
An example that comes into my mind is you have in Florence in the Spanish chapel, in the cycle of frescoes painted by Andrea da Firenze, there is a very vivid detail where you see Peter Martyr preaching to the heretics.
Mm.
And in fact, he is holding his hand in front.
Oh, really?
And it's amazing because there's
Yes.
he's kind of showing, like he is been reading
Uh-huh.
this and knowing what to do. And he's showing the heretics like point by point. And then
There you go.
it could be this in practice.
Absolutely, absolutely. He probably had his division of points right there, making sure that he wasn't going to lose his place, right? Yeah, yeah. Yes, exactly. Well, there are, Lena Bolzoni has discovered references in the sermons, 15th century sermons, Italian sermons, to the various wings of the seraph, the feathers on the wings. You know, now I'll go on to the fourth feather, and things of that sort. So you do get these sort of casual references to these mnemonic structures being used in that way. Larry.
Mentioning the Psalter, lovely talk, very informative, much to think about. When you mentioned the Psalter just a moment ago,
Yeah.
Gospel canon tables,
Yeah.
architectural structures, as I seem to recall,
Yeah.
beginning of the New Testament manuscript at the end, occasionally.
Yeah.
Has anyone worked on that? You know?
Art historians have worked on it. A number have, yeah. But it's a classic case of the grouping, and in groups of about 4 or 5 items, usually then with some sort of marker to indicate the next group and so on. When you see things that are grouped in that way, very often it does have some sort of
Remember the architectural detail.
absolutely, absolutely within an architectural framework like that. Yeah, it's more memorable to have a nice set of columns than just a plain old tables like that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
So I'm interested in the gray zone where you have images without explicit instructions. I'm not sure, but I think when you showed that Mappamundi and said that this was a part of all the manuscripts and not an add-on, and that it was meant to be deployed as in the process of learning the text, that was in fact a case where the instructions for how to put the picture together with the text isn't part of the manuscript, but because of the presence of that image in all the manuscripts and your sense of what was just absolutely ubiquitous in the period, it's safe to presume that kind of deployment would have been expected.
Expected, understood, yeah.
Understood by every educated reader.
Well, but remember, it's a monastic community.
Uh-huh.
We're not talking about a large readership. We're talking about a rather special and self-perpetuating monastic community.
But when you, what about, are there pictures where you look at them and could you maybe reflect on your own reading practice when you see a picture and you're not sure if it's a memorial, a memory arts image, or if it's meant to exemplify some kind of principle like microcosm, macrocosm, as was discussed in this building not long ago, or obviously, for example, in Andrea's timelines, historical images, where those are full of texts that would seem to violate every good advice that you mentioned about keeping these relatively clutter-free. What do you do with those kinds of images? How do you approach them and understand whether they fit into this rubric or don't?
Well, I would say this: any drawing can be used mnemonically if you choose to do so. That does not obviate it's being used in many, many, many other sorts of ways. I think all of these are used in many, many other sorts of ways. I resist, and I have for a long time resisted, a tendency that I first ran into amongst art historians, actually, to make generic distinctions. So, you know, this is a mnemonic picture, but somehow this is a narrative picture, or this one's a pedagogical picture, because it doesn't make any sense to me. I mean, fundamentally, if you can't remember something, you don't know it. So in that sense, every image that brings to mind something else, something that you know, is serving a mnemonic function, right? I mean, it just by definition. Very often the mnemonic function is rather boring, frankly. I mean, you know, it's kind of, it's a basis on which you can build all sorts of things. And it's just something that, you know, it's like saying that, you know, it's got paints on it or something like that, you know. Very, very basic information. But, I mean, yeah, there are I think actually for moderns, it was much more challenging when something like, not this one particularly, but, you know, when they ran into this, for example, modern historians looking at something like this wondered, what in the world is this little figure doing in the bottom here? Because, you know, there's that long, long prejudice that's from the 19th century onward that pictures are for children. So, you know, so some idiot obviously needs this. I mean, in this otherwise very, very, you know, learned sort of book. What's it doing there?
Is it the only image there?
No.
In the book?
No, there are a whole bunch of them. Unfortunately, somebody came through with a razor blade at some point and cut most of these images out.
Oh.
And there are many, many others.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. Absolutely. And this, so I mean, it gives you, what it does, of course, is to give you a sense of the dialogue, the disputatio, to use the term, between the commentators themselves, which is in Peter Lombard, to be sure, but still, I mean, it's emphasized by this kind of thing. And similarly, as far as I know, Marcia probably knows more than I do about this one, but I'm going the wrong way. This, I think, when it first came into these books and people started looking at these books, they really didn't know what in the world this was doing here.
Well, there is an instruction from the author.
That's
going
right.
Back to the 8th century, gives the instruction of what it means.
What it
and
means.
What it's doing there.
And what it's supposed to be, yes, right.
So it's the field of the world on which where the apostles have sown. This is all about the sort of the apostolic dissemination at the. It occurs in an apocalypse commentary. So, it is all of, in a way, it's all of history, you know, from the beginning of time in Eden, and it's prefacing the end of time. So what makes the map a very nice memory structure really is that geography is very stable. Things aren't moving around, so it is an order. It's a fixed order in which you can then associate things. And for this particular author, he's interested in the world, in the apocalypse, not just as something that happens in the future, but it represents the state of the church at every age.
Right.
So this is a kind of portrait of the church in every age, and it's a kind of preface to the whole book. You know, John, who has the vision, he says, "Let's go." He in the book of Revelation, he goes up and he's in the spirit.
Right.
He rises up,
Right.
and Beatus uses this to open his whole commentary, and so you have this overview
Right.
of everything.
Right. And it's kind of it's also like the ancient philosophical kataskopos, in Greek philosophy and in meditation, where you rise up, and Latin as well, of course, where you're taken up into a higher place and look down on the earth as a structure again for philosophical meditation.
What people have done is they take this whole series of
manuscripts and all the different maps and try to trace out what people knew about geography,
Yes,
when
exactly.
and where, and just reduce them all to
Right.
cartographic
Exactly.
reportage.
Yes. Right.
A shame.
Yeah, and there are, of course, as Marcia said, the roots in here are both historical, that is temporal roots, but they're also geographical roots. I mean, Rome is always very much prominent. I think that's Rome there, isn't it? Yep. And Jerusalem, which is that Jerusalem there?
It's not very, it's not,
Should be east of Rome.
Well,
it's Judea is right,
should be over in here,
yeah, below.
or is that Jerusalem?
Here's Judea.
Here, that's Judea.
Wait, I can't read from here. Okay, well that's Jerusalem then. There, right. Okay, there's the Nile. I got confused. I thought that was the Nile there. It's not. Here's the Nile down here. Okay.
Oh, they got the sources wrong.
Oh well. But it's a machine. I mean, it really is an inventive machine. But it doesn't tell you, other than these very basic characteristics, what to think. I think is important.
Okay. Well, thank you all.
Thank you all for coming. Yes.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Okay.
Continue. We
Yeah.
have our.
Yeah, we will indeed. We will indeed. Okay. All right. Was that too long? I hope not.
No, not
Okay.
at all.
All right.
Oh, yeah.
He presumably has to have this